Hey everyone, I'm Adam Dede and welcome to Neurojournal Club. Today we're going to be talking about the effects of DMT on the brain. But first, some shopkeeping. If you like the video, please hit the thumbs up, share the video, go ahead and subscribe, and click the link below to support me on Patreon. Cool. So, today's question, what does DMT do to brain signals? So in the last few videos, we've been talking a lot about meditation. Today we're going to talk about DMT. And the goal here is just to examine another kind of altered state of consciousness and what does that do to the brain. So DMT, or N,N-dimethyltryptamine, is sometimes referred to as the God molecule. It's the same molecule that you find in ayahuasca. It's very similar in structure to the active molecules in LSD and in psilocybin. And it also bears a resemblance to serotonin. So it probably has an effect through serotonin receptors in the brain, and indeed in vitro studies do show that DMT has a high affinity for binding to serotonin receptors in the petri dish. But what does it do in the brain, and what are the effects? So in order to study DMT, we're going to be looking at a study from Timmerman, Roseman, Carhart-Harris, and other colleagues. One thing I'm going to caution you with, this study has not been reviewed. It is not a peer-reviewed study. This is currently in preprint, which means that the authors have put the study up on the internet for people to take a look at while they go through the peer review process, but at this point the study has not been peer-reviewed, so keep that grain of salt. So in this study they had 13 volunteers. The mean age of the volunteers was 34.4, 6 female, no prior psychedelic experience in any of the volunteers, and all generally healthy. So mentally healthy, physically healthy. All of these guys went through a pretty rigorous check. So in order to study the DMT effects, they're going to first give the participants a saline injection. Now the participants don't know when the saline injection is going to come and when the DMT injection is going to come. But first the participants are going to receive a saline injection. And then they're going to get a DMT injection 1 week later. And the key thing here is going to be to take a look at how do these participants react to the saline and to the DMT. The participants receive between 7 and 20 milligrams of DMT, so that's another caveat with this study is that there is some variability in the amount of DMT that the participants are receiving. Now the authors didn't seem to find any real dose-response curve, so they just grouped everybody together. But we are under the hood, there is a little bit of variability going on there. The eyes were closed, and they were in a semi-supine position, so kind of imagine like a dentist chair, except you don't have to do anything with your teeth. They're just kind of lying there, relaxing. And then they're going to take EEG measurement, so electroencephalogram, measuring electrical activity from the brain. And they're also going to take subjective reports, just asking people, what are you experiencing? So the first thing to take a look at here are those subjective reports. So on the y-axis of this graph, we're looking at the intensity of the experience. So every minute, the participants were asked just how intense is the experience that you're currently feeling, scale 1 to 10. And what we can see here is that when participants are receiving DMT, shown in the purple, their intensity is a lot higher than when they're receiving the placebo, and they tend to just have an intensity below 1 for the whole way through it. So something's going on. They're feeling something. And then to take a look at the subjective effects in a little bit more detail, after the experience, participants were asked about a whole bunch of different subjective effects, and they rated again on that 1 to 10 scale. And what we're looking at here is the ratings of those effects both on DMT and on placebo. So let's go through them one at a time. So the strongest effect was that participants said that on DMT they felt like they were in a different reality or a different dimension. Participants also reported seeing geometric patterns. They felt like they had an altered sense of size and space. They had unusual body sensations, so anything that would normally be going on in the body, they felt like strange things were happening in their body. They found the experience generally pleasurable. Now, one thing to take a look at here is that the placebo also was experienced as generally pleasurable. So it might just be that kind of lying still and relaxing is generally pleasurable. They felt displaced from their body, so kind of an out-of-body experience. there was high intensity, and that's what we saw in the previous graph. They had elaborate, complex visuals. And one thing that you can notice here is that a few of these kind of play on visuals. It seems like the visual experience is very strong in DMT. They had vivid imagination, so again, more visual. They had a general feeling of gratitude, so generally positive affect going on here, and that goes along with the experience being generally pleasurable. They felt like it was dreamlike, and that makes sense when we think about this being altered sense of time and space, displaced from the body, all of that kind of different reality, different dimension, all of that kind of goes along with the idea of it being dreamlike. Things looked strange, so just generally weirdness, going along again with the visuals. They felt like they were open and sensitive to emotion, so kind of raw feeling. Presence of other intelligence. So this was something that did not happen at all for the placebo, and kind of a weird thing to imagine, this idea that there's some other intelligence that these participants felt like was there with them in the room, in their experience, while they were on DMT. They felt a disintegration of the self and of the ego, so a selflessness. Their time sense was altered, so the passage of time felt very different, and this is something, if you talk to people who have done DMT, they'll report that even though, as we saw in the previous graph, that subjective intensity kind of peaked very quickly and dropped off very quickly, it can feel like it's a much longer amount of time. And then thoughts wandered freely, so they're kind of thinking about all kinds of stuff. They felt that it was more real than reality. So something about this very strange set of attributes actually felt more real than normal experience. The sounds influenced vision, so they had some kind of synesthesia going on. There's a crossover going on between the senses, and the experience was hard. So it's pleasurable, they feel gratitude, but it's hard. This is not an easy walk in the park, at least as far as these participants are concerned. So let's take a look now at what the brain is doing. So here, what we're looking at is the amplitude of different frequency bands, and we're looking at it on these maps across the whole brain. And one thing that we can immediately see is that each of these maps, where the nose is at the top, the ears are on the side, so we're kind of looking down at the top of the head, each of these maps has a roughly uniform color across the whole map. And what that tells us is that the whole brain is kind of increasing or decreasing its oscillation kind of in sync. Now this makes sense because what we're looking at here is averaged electrical activity from the entire period of the study. So that kind of is going to necessarily mean that we get something that looks pretty uniform across the whole brain when we do that kind of averaging. Okay, so let's break this down a little bit in terms of the frequency of these waves. So here what we're looking at are delta, theta, alpha, beta, and gamma oscillations in the brain. Now delta oscillations are really slow oscillations. That's an oscillation that moves kind of one every 250 milliseconds, 4 cycles per second, all the way up to gamma, which is anything, in this case they're binning it as anything above 30 cycles per second, so really quite fast if you're doing something 30 times every second. Now the big effect that you can see here, it's been color-coded to show you increases versus decreases, where warmer colors are increases and cooler colors are decreases. The big thing to take a look at here is really the alpha band, that band between 8 and 13 cycles per second. And what you can see here is that there's a massive decrease in the amplitude of alpha. And if we look down here in the bottom panel of this figure, we can see that on placebo, there's really a huge amount of alpha activity going on that is just completely obliterated on DMT. There's just no more alpha going on. Now the alpha oscillation is an oscillation that we've talked about a little bit before. It's one that is always seen when the eyes are closed and the participant is relaxed. It's kind of thought of as this like default pattern, but we'll talk a little bit more about what alpha might mean in a minute. The big thing here though is that it is gone. There is no more alpha happening in these participants on DMT. Really massive effect. And then you can see that there's this little shoulder, little bump of increase going on in theta. But one reason that in the map we may not really be seeing too much of that is that there's a little bit of an increase, but then you can also see at the top end of the band there's a relative decrease. So since this map that we're looking at here is an average across this whole band, you can see that that average would end up being essentially zero. Hence we see these kind of cool greeny yellow kind of colors indicating that we're right in the middle of our increase-decrease range. So let's take a look at these same data in another way. So here we're taking a look at the same type of amplitude or power data at different frequency bands, but we're taking a look at it across time. So in this figure, we have that intensity measure, so that's what this line is that's cutting across. That's that same intensity measure that we were looking at before, so the subjective experience that the participants are having. And then in the heat map, what we see are that yellow colors indicate high power, so big oscillations, big waves, and blue equals small power, so small oscillations, small waves. And then lower down here on the y-axis, we have delta oscillations. In the middle here, we have theta, and then alpha, and then up towards the top, we have beta and gamma. So first, let's just take a look in the alpha band. That was where we can see we have the really big reduction in the oscillation. And what you can see is that there is indeed a pretty strong drop-off in alpha oscillation that happens just about immediately after this dashed red line indicating when the injection of DMT is being given. And you can see that the alpha oscillation kind of slowly works its way back in, and then as the intensity drops off, we also see that the alpha oscillation is coming back in really full force. Now, down here in the theta band, we have another interesting phenomenon going on, which seems to be that right at the very peak of the DMT experience, when it's at its absolute most intensity, we get this little blush of increased theta activity. And that right there is likely to be this little bump that we're seeing on the overall spectrogram for averaged across the whole session. Now, what's interesting here is that because it's so temporally limited, it's just happening in the very highest intensity portion of the DMT experience, it ends up being a pretty small bump in the average, but it may actually be a pretty large effect. So to take a look in a little bit more detail, let's see how that theta oscillation amplitude correlates with experience, and specifically how it correlates with all those aspects of experience that we talked about before. So everything from intensity, which is what we've mostly been talking about, to strange visuals, bodily sensations, dreamlike qualities, openness to emotion, challenging experience, all of the full gamut, the whole range of things. Okay, and so what we're looking at here in this graph is a heat map of correlation, where red colors tend to indicate a stronger correlation between the amplitude of theta and the particular aspect of experience, and cool colors tend to indicate a weaker correlation between that aspect of experience and the oscillation in the brain. And what we can see here is that right at that point where the intensity is peaking, right at that point where the theta amplitude is peaking, there seems to be a positive correlation between the strength of the theta oscillation and the strength of the various subjective experience attributes. So this kind of underlines the idea that although it is a very brief period where that theta oscillation is strong, it might be a fairly meaningful period. Okay, so now let's turn and take a look at the same type of data, but now we're looking at how the strength of the alpha oscillation relates to the strength of the experience. And what we can see here is that the experience and the alpha oscillation seem to have a negative correlation with each other. So what that means is that the stronger the alpha oscillation, the weaker the experience. So this is really exactly the opposite of what we saw with the theta oscillation. And the other thing to take home here is that it's not as temporally limited as the theta oscillation. So the alpha oscillation reduction seems to be something that's important for the subjective experience all the way through, where the theta oscillation increase was only really affecting the experience in that brief period of high intensity. So, what conclusions can we draw from this? So the DMT causes a dramatic drop in alpha, that's for sure. There's a huge drop in the alpha oscillation. DMT causes a modest rise in theta, so that is a little bit harder to really pinpoint just because the rise is a little bit more modest, but it does seem like it causes something of a rise in the theta oscillation. So there seems to also be a correlation between brain and experience. So these decreases in alpha, increases in theta, they do seem to correlate with the experience that the participants report of being on DMT. And there's a wide range of experienced phenomena. So people are experiencing everything from out-of-body experiences to open emotion to some kind of other intelligence in the room with them. They're experiencing it as hard, they're experiencing it as pleasurable, they're experiencing general gratitude. There's a lot of stuff going on during this DMT trip. Okay, so now how do we interpret this? There's kind of a lot to unpack in a study like this. So first let's think about, what does the alpha oscillation mean? Is it something that's just a default? Is it something that we see during meditation? So in some of the videos that I've posted previously, we've talked about how the alpha oscillation is classically found whenever a participant is just sitting there with their eyes closed, not really paying attention to anything. And we also see that the alpha oscillation increases during meditation. Now, one key difference in the way that the alpha oscillation changes in that default state of just sitting with your eyes closed versus the meditative state is that during meditation, the alpha oscillation seems to increase even at frontal areas of the brain, where during the default state, the alpha oscillation is more limited to the posterior areas of the brain. Now here, in the case of DMT, what we saw was that the alpha oscillation reduced across the whole brain. So that seems to be an indication then that it's more similar to meditation in terms of where it's happening, except in meditation we tended to see an increase in the alpha oscillation, whereas here we're seeing a decrease. Now one thing to kind of color that even more, in the study that we looked at of the Japanese Zen meditators, and I've got a link to it down below in case you missed that video, what we found was that the alpha oscillation increased, but then eventually there was a switch over to a theta oscillation that was seen in the most experienced of the monks. So that might be something akin to what's going on here, that the DMT experience, to the extent that it's at all similar to the meditation experience, might be actually quite similar to a very advanced meditative experience where you switch over to that theta oscillation. So then theta has a similar dichotomy to think about. It could be early stage sleep is one place where we see a lot of theta oscillations in the brain, or it could be similar to meditation, as we just talked about, where you have these really experienced Zen meditators that kind of switch over from an alpha state into a theta state. Now, to explore the sleep idea a little bit, it does kind of seem like these participants are experiencing something very dreamlike. And one thing that cautions you in thinking about comparing this to the meditation state subjectively is that although a lot of these really out there experiences are something that can happen during meditation, strange perceptions happen during meditation, wild mood swings happen during meditation, an openness to emotion, all kinds of weird sensations can happen during meditation. All of that is true, but it does also seem like when people get very, very concentrated in meditation to an extreme level, they move past this beginner stage of going all over the place, and they reach a point of extreme one-pointedness that leads to a very uniform rapture, bright light, pleasant, loving kindness kind of experience. And that's not what we're seeing here in these DMT participants. They have the theta oscillation going on in the reduced alpha, which you might argue is similar to a high meditative state, but they don't seem to have the subjective experience of a high meditative state. They aren't experiencing just kind of pure rapture and bliss. Instead, they're going all over the place and experiencing a wide range of stuff. So might this be premature enlightenment that the DMT is inducing? Their brains aren't ready for that theta state with the low alpha. Or maybe it's just that this is something totally different, and DMT and meditation is kind of a weird comparison to make. Subjectively, is it like dreaming? So I'd say here, yeah, it is kind of like dreaming. Dreaming is something where you can go all over the place. You can experience all kinds of emotions. You can experience all kinds of sensations. So this is something like a wake lucid dream in a way, in terms of the subjective experience. Now, how do the oscillations of the brain relate to the oscillations of the brain while dreaming? That's not an area that I'm super expert in, so not something I'll be ready to weigh in on, but maybe something we'll take a look at in some future videos. And then one question that was coming up for me is, what about gamma? So we didn't see any change in the gamma oscillation going on here, but in meditation, especially recent studies have started to show that very experienced meditators will show really pretty dramatic increases in gamma oscillation. So what's going on there? Why don't we see any changes in gamma with DMT? Really just an open question. And then what about coherence? So another thing that happens during meditative states is that you see widespread coherence where the whole brain seems to be oscillating together, and that might be something that underlies the kind of super concentrated one-pointedness that goes on during meditative states. But we don't see that here. Instead, we just kind of see people being kind of all over the place. In fact, one thing I didn't go into here, this study actually looked at, was the amount of signal diversity, and they found that there was a huge increase in signal diversity, so the amount of different signals going on, which in some ways might actually be the opposite of coherence. Now, they didn't measure coherence here. It'd be nice if we actually had that as a direct way to take a look at these data. But it is something that to my mind feels missing as we think about how to think about the DMT experience versus normal wakefulness, meditation, sleep, dreaming, as we start making kind of a catalog of different mental states. Where does DMT fit? And I'd really want to know what kind of coherence are we looking at across the brain. And then what about regularity? So one thing that we see with sleep and that we see with meditation is that there's quite a bit of regularity in brain signals from moment to moment, minute to minute. We see a lot of repetition. Now here, that's something that they didn't really look at, how much regularity was there in the signal, but it's again something that would be kind of interesting to know. So that's the video for today. I hope you liked it, hope you learned something. One thing to take home from this is that DMT causes a dramatic drop in alpha oscillation, a small rise in theta oscillation, and a whole slew of crazy subjective experiences. Doesn't seem to cause any harm, so that's kind of cool. Now, if you liked the video, please hit the thumbs up, share the video with anyone that you think might be interested, subscribe to the channel, and click the link below to support me on Patreon. That's the video for today. Thanks for watching.